Hi everyone. In the last video, we talked about different ways to create curves. This video is going to focus on hatch patterns, what they are, why we use them, and finally, how to create them in AutoCAD. Let's get started. Hatch patterns are typically used in architectural drawings and technical drawings to show the different material types. They're a graphic indication of what something is, especially if we've cut it through in a section. So on the screen here are some typical or standard material types and what they might look like cut through in section: brick, concrete, concrete block or CMU, wood. Structural lumber is usually shown with an X through it. It's not exactly a hatch pattern, but same thing. Plywood. Here are some metals down here. A steel beam, for example, will have this double line pattern. Earth and stone. Here is the hatch pattern for earth. Sand, usually just a dot or a stipple pattern. Marble will have kind of an indication of those lines through it. Insulation, and a couple of other things such as glass or gypsum board or drywall. So here's an example of how some hatch patterns are used um, to tell the difference between two different materials, and also really to indicate which items we're cutting through and which items are beyond the cut plane and we're just looking at the elevation of them. So in this millwork section right here, we're cutting through the paneling that's been applied to a wall. And so they're using two different hatch patterns to indicate these two different materials right here. And then the annotation tells you exactly what those are. All right, I've kind of done a blown up view of it so you can see it here. Now, neither of those are kind of a standard wood trim hatch pattern. So what we're really trying to do here is designate between or differentiate between the two different materials that we're cutting through. And then you can see this piece back here, we're not cutting through. That is the edge of a panel beyond. So it's by the addition of these hatch patterns, it's very, very easy to graphically tell that there are two separate materials and we are cutting through them. So that's how hatch patterns are used in architectural drawing or technical drawings. Let's talk about how they're used in AutoCAD. In AutoCAD, you can use hatch patterns to fill existing objects or enclosed areas. Using this tool, you can choose from some predefined hatch patterns, and that's mostly what you're going to do, and that's what we're going to cover today. You can add some hatch pattern libraries, some predefined hatch pattern libraries, or you can use the standard installation. You can use a solid fill, and I'll show you why this is not one of my favorite options. You can use a gradient fill. You can create some user-defined hatch patterns or custom hatch patterns, and those are beyond the scope of this class. We're not going to talk about those today. So how do you find the command? It is the hatch command, or the shortcut is H, just the letter H. And it's located on the Home tab Draw panel, this icon right here. Some hints for using the hatch command. First, always have your boundaries already drawn before you enter this command. Second, I strongly suggest that you always create a separate layer for your hatch objects. Why? First of all, you are often going to want them at a different line weight than other objects. And while you're drafting in AutoCAD, you sometimes have trouble snapping to the correct things if the hatch patterns are on. So it's useful to turn them off, to put them on a layer and turn them off. And finally, hatch patterns in AutoCAD use a huge amount of memory. All right, so if you have them on their own layer, you can then freeze that layer if you're getting a slow response or lag, and that will speed up your file. And that directly leads me to my last hint here. The hatch command itself is sometimes subject to a lot of lag when it's detecting boundaries. All right, so one way to speed this up is to turn off or freeze, freeze works better, any layers with text, dimensions, leaders. Those are typically not your hatch boundaries, and yet they can have very, very complicated boundaries, and they really, really slow down your hatch command. So if you're getting some lag, freeze any layers that have text, dimensions, and leaders. All right, I've popped over into AutoCAD and we're going to demonstrate some of the things that we just talked about. I drew a couple of squares and rectangles here for us to use and fill with hatch. So let's go over here to the Home tab, Draw Panel, and choose the Hatch command. And it gives us the Hatch Creation tab. So the first thing you want to do right here is to decide how you're going to select the boundaries of your hatch object. Are you going to pick points within your objects, or are you going to select objects? Let me demonstrate. If you pick points, it's going to take a look at everything that is drawn on your screen and select an internal point from there. So as I am hovering over these different areas, AutoCAD is finding these boundaries for me and giving me a little preview. The other option is to select objects. All right, and when you've chosen select, you get the little square selection pick box. Okay, and you can hover over items and choose them as your boundary. You can choose multiple items with this option. Okay. So I'm going to select this rectangle, this square right there, and you can see it gives me a little preview of what that hatch would look like. It selects the entire object as the boundary. Okay, that's very different than the pick points when we chose inside this area, because that one didn't include that little corner. All right, so I'm happy with that boundary. So now I'll move to the second section, which is pattern. AutoCAD comes with a lot of preloaded patterns, and you can see them by clicking this arrow right here and expanding this little window. And then there's a scroll bar, so you can see there's a lot of patterns here. Some of the more common patterns we use are this one, which is just a simple diagonal slash. What else? This one, which is a concrete pattern. What else do we have? A brick, a sand, that's another common one. Earth. Here are some of the gradients. And then there's a bunch that I rarely use, like a honeycomb or a net, etc. Stars. I don't think I've ever used stars. All right. So let's pick your simple diagonal line and C31, all right? And then we can move to the properties palette here, or tab, whatever it is. It's not a palette. And we can choose the color, which is by layer. We can choose a background color. I've never really used this option. None is my standard. We can choose whether your hatch is transparent. And then this is important, this piece right here, the angle and the scale. Now I was playing with the angle earlier, so I've got an odd number of 11. But you can see by grabbing this bar right here, you can dynamically choose the angle of your hatch pattern, or you can click in this little box right here. Where is it? Click it. Come on. All right. And you can set a standard one like 90 degrees or 0, which is the default. All right. The scale is very important, and you can either choose a scale, for example, 100. You can use these little arrows just to adjust it a little bit up or down. And if you can't see a hatch, the usual problem is the scale is way too big so that you're just looking at like a blank spot in between the lines. Or if your hatch it just comes out as a solid, even though it's supposed to be a pattern, the scale is usually way too small. All right, so double check your hatch scale. If you're using something like a brick or a tile pattern where you want to select where that pattern starts, you can use the Set Origin option. And in this case, you can make your hatch pattern annotative. Or this is a useful thing, you can match the properties of a hatch pattern you've already drawn. So we're done with this particular hatch pattern. And so I'm going to click the little green check mark button and be done with that one, or you can hit return. Okay. So let's take a look at the hatch pattern that I've drawn. I can select it as an object. And once you've selected it, you get the Hatch Editor tab again. I guess that was the Hatch Creation tab. This is the Hatch Editor tab, but they're exactly the same thing. All right, but notice the hatch object does not have very many grips. Okay, you can't pull and stretch the edges of it or any of the individual lines. Okay, it does have this origin, this origin point that you can pull over here and move the entire thing. I'm going to undo that. And I also want to show you that hatch patterns are associated with their boundaries. This is a powerful tool that when you change the boundary object, now I'm not selecting the hatch itself, I'm selecting the rectangle that I chose as the boundary. All right, then your hatch pattern will also change at the same time. So there's a lot of different options here when creating your hatch pattern, and I really encourage you to explore all of them on their own. Okay, everybody, so in this week we covered some of the ways to draw curves and polylines, and then some different ways to use hatch patterns in your drawings. Now, if you are following along with the textbook, you're going to say, but Sarah, you didn't cover splines, and you didn't cover gradients, and you didn't cover how to use gradients to render your elevations. Truthfully, I find none of those things to be very common or very useful in my architectural practice. So I'm going to slide past them this week and really focus on the things that are very, very common and you're going to use every day. That's going to be arcs, it's going to be polylines, and it will be hatch patterns. So thanks, everybody. I hope this helped you with some of the more complicated commands that we've learned this semester. Surprise, surprise, we're getting towards the end of the book. And you're really starting to learn some of the powerful tools.